February 21st, 1945. 9:30 hours. The meat grinder, Iwo Jima. Corporal Frank Smokey Harris, 20 years old, tasted the sulfur in his throat. It was a gritty volcanic ash that coated everything, mixing with the salt spray and the metallic tang of fear. He lay flat, his face pressed into the black sand, his 72-pound M2 Flamethrower a lead and steel cross on his back. 50 yards ahead, the world was a haze of smoke and high explosive. A Japanese Type 96 Nambu machine gun, hidden in a pillbox of black rock and concrete, was methodically, rhythmically tearing his platoon to pieces. The M1 Garands of his squad mates pinged harmlessly against the concrete embrasure. The barman fired a long, desperate burst, the tracers just sparking and disappearing into the darkness of the slit. 2 men from Baker Company had tried to crawl forward with grenades. They were both dead, their bodies twisted in the sand, a testament to the futility of conventional arms. The squad leader, a sergeant with a face like old leather, crawled over to him. He didn't yell. In the din of the shelling, he just tapped Smokey's helmet and pointed. It was the simplest of gestures. It meant, "You're up. Go fix it." Smokey was a marked man. The Japanese snipers hidden in the crags of Mount Suribachi above knew his silhouette. The man with the 2 tanks on his back was the priority target. He was a walking bomb. He felt the cold, sloshing weight of the napalm gasoline mix shift as he rose into a low crouch. His squad gave him everything they had, a wall of suppressing fire. He ran, clumsy and heavy, his heart a hammer in his chest. In his hand, he gripped the wand, the trigger, the Mjolnir of the Marine Corps. He was not a rifleman. He was not a soldier, not in the way his father had been in 1918. He was an exterminator. He was the bringer of a primal liquid fire, and he knew with a cold certainty that the men inside that bunker were not afraid of a bullet. But they were, with all their souls, terrified of him. The flamethrower was not a new weapon. It was a terrifying, archaic terror, dragged from the trenches of the Great War. But in the European theater, against the mobile blitzkrieg of the Wehrmacht, it was a specialized, almost niche weapon. In the Pacific, it became the key. It became the one and only solution to the most complex tactical problem of the modern age, the Japanese defensive doctrine. This was a war unlike any other. The American island-hopping campaign across the Central Pacific, Tarawa, Peleliu, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, was not a war of maneuver. It was a war of excavation. It was a brutal head-on siege against a fortress world. The Japanese, under brilliant, ruthless commanders like Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi on Iwo Jima, had abandoned the suicidal banzai charges on the beach. They had learned. Their new strategy, Ketsugo, Operation Decisive, was a masterpiece of military engineering and fanatical defense. It was a strategy of no surrender. The Japanese soldier, steeped in the Bushido Code, would fight to the last man, but he would not fight in the open. He would fight from within the island itself. Iwo Jima was not just an island. It was a honeycomb. Kuribayashi had spent a year turning its 8 square miles into the most formidable fortress in human history. He had built over 1,500 interconnected bunkers, pillboxes, and blockhouses. These were not shallow foxholes. They were multi-story subterranean complexes with 10-foot thick concrete walls, reinforced by steel, and connected by over 16 miles of tunnels. A single machine gun nest, like the one pinning Smokey Harris down, was not an isolated position. It was the firing slit for a concrete bunker that was, in turn, connected to a mortar battery 100 yards away, and a command bunker 50 feet below ground. Conventional weapons were useless. Naval gunfire, even from 16-inch battleship guns, just bounced off. Aerial bombardment, which had turned the surface of the island into a moonscape, left the defenders untouched and waiting. M1 rifles, bars, and .30 caliber machine guns were utterly impotent against a 6-inch wide concrete embrasure. Demolition charges were vital, but a Marine had to get to the bunker to place the charge, a suicidal run. The fortress was perfect. It was a tactical problem that could not be solved with a bullet or a bomb. It needed something else. It needed fire. The men who volunteered to be flamethrower operators were a breed apart. They were often the largest, strongest men in the platoon, chosen for their ability to hump the 72-pound M2 across the volcanic ash and coral ridges. The M2 was a simple, brutalist piece of technology. It consisted of 2 tanks of fuel, a thickened napalm gasoline mix, and a smaller third tank of pressurized nitrogen, the propellant. In the operator's hands was the wand, a 3-foot-long metal tube with 2 triggers. The first released the fuel. The second, a spring-loaded ignition, sparked a hydrogen-filled cartridge, lighting the stream. To carry it was to live with a constant cold dread. The operator was the primus inter pares of targets. Japanese doctrine, drilled into every imperial soldier, was to kill the flamethrower operator first, and at all costs. They were the marked men, hunted by snipers, machine gunners, and mortar teams. A single rifle round striking the pressurized tanks would not, as movies depicted, cause a massive fireball. The real fear was around puncturing the fuel tanks. The operator would be hosed down head to toe in his own napalm, a flammable, sticky jelly. The next tracer round would turn him into a human candle. But the psychological burden was as heavy as the physical one. A rifleman killed at a distance. His kill was an abstraction, a target that fell. The flamethrower operator killed at 30 yards. It was intimate, visceral, and absolute. The Marines, in their gallows humor, had a name for their assault teams: blowtorch and corkscrew. The flamethrower was the blowtorch. He was the man sent to do the dirty work. His job was not to kill. It was to incinerate. It was to cremate. He was the man who had to listen to the screams. The man who had to smell the results, a smell, they said, of carbonized meat and burnt hair that never, ever washed out of your fatigues. For Private Kenjiro Tanaka, a 19-year-old conscript of the 109th Division, his bunker on Iwo Jima was his shiro, his castle. It was his home, his tomb, and his sacred altar to the emperor. For 6 months, he and his comrades had been digging in the volcanic rock, their hands bleeding, their bodies ravaged by dysentery, all for this one final battle. His confidence, in the face of the massive American fleet, was absolute. His concrete nest was a masterpiece. The firing slit, or splay, was angled at 30 degrees, giving his Nambu a perfect field of fire over the beach, while making it impossible for an American rifleman to fire into it. He had food, water, and thousands of rounds of ammunition. He was connected by a telephone line to his platoon sergeant in a deeper chamber, and if the Americans overran his position, his orders were clear. He was to pull the pin on his Type 99 grenade, hold it to his chest, and die for his emperor. He had watched the naval bombardment, the steel rain, Taifu no Tetsu, for 3 days. It had been terrifying, the sound of physical concussive force. But when it lifted, he and his comrades had simply crawled from the deep tunnels, manned their guns, and waited. The Americans were fools. They believed the battle was won by steel. He knew it was won by Seishin, spirit. His concrete and his spirit were an unbreakable shield. He was prepared to die by a bullet. He was prepared to die by a grenade. He was prepared to die by his own hand. The one thing his Bushido code had not, and could not, prepare him for, was death by fire. He had no context for a weapon that could turn his invincible concrete tomb into a 3,000-degree oven in 1 second. Corporal Smokey Harris was in the blind spot. He had made the 50-yard run, his lungs on fire, his squad's bars and M1s chewing the concrete around the aperture, forcing Private Tanaka to duck. Harris pressed his back against the bunker, the concrete hot from the impacts. He was deafened by the roar of the Nambu, just inches away, on the other side of the wall. He unslung the wand. He checked his gauges. He was ready. He gave the signal. The bar went silent. A Marine in a shell crater 20 yards away screamed, "Jap! Jap!" trying to draw the gunner's attention. Harris stepped in front of the slit. He pulled both triggers. The world dissolved in a whoosh roar. A torrent of liquid fire, a solid, cohesive stream of burning, jellied gasoline, slammed out of the wand at 100 miles per hour. It was not a flame, it was a jet. It hit the far side of the concrete embrasure and splashed. It behaved like water, but it was water that was 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit. It flowed through the 6-inch slit, around the corner of the angled splay, and into the bunker. For Private Tanaka, the world ended. It was not a fire he could dodge. It was an atmosphere that was instantly totally replaced. The liquid fire, the napalm, hit the far wall and splashed back, coating him, his machine gun, his ammunition, and the very air itself. In 1/10 of a second, every molecule of oxygen in the small concrete room was consumed, sucked into the chemical reaction. Tanaka took a final breath, but it was not air. It was a superheated carbon monoxide-filled vacuum. His lungs flash-boiled, his hair, his uniform, his skin, all vaporized before his brain could even register the concept of pain. The ammunition in his rifle belts began to cook off, the rounds exploding in a chain reaction, pop, 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 pop. Smokey held the trigger for 6 seconds, a solid 6-second burst. Then he stopped. The roar was replaced by a sudden sickening silence. Then came the screams, not from the first chamber, Those men were dead, but from the tunnels. A man, his uniform and skin fused into a single black smoking mass, stumbled out of the bunker's rear exit, his hands raised, screaming in a language that was no longer human. He was shot by the squad's barman. Then another. Then two more, their hands up, completely, utterly broken. They had chosen capture, the ultimate shame over the alternative. The fortress was breached. This was the terror the Marines recognized. The flamethrower was not just a weapon of death, it was a weapon of choice. The Japanese soldiers' doctrine was built on a fanatical, fatalistic acceptance of death. A bullet was honorable. A grenade was honorable. Kamikaze was honorable. But the flamethrower introduced a variable that Bushido had no answer for. Primal, existential terror. This was not a clean, swift death. This was cremation. This was an agonizing, suffocating, subterranean inferno. The Marines, who had grown to respect the Japanese soldiers' suicidal bravery, saw this weapon do what nothing else could: break their spirit. The flamethrower bypassed the honor of the Bushido Code and attacked the lizard brain of the human being. The unexpected outcome was this. The flamethrower was the only weapon in the U.S. arsenal that could consistently produce prisoners. On Saipan, on Iwo Jima, on Okinawa, the story repeated. A bunker would be holding up an entire company. A blowtorch team would be called up. They would fire one short warning burst near the entrance. Then, a Marine, often a Nisei translator, would get on a loudspeaker. "You have felt the fire! You know what is next. Come out with your hands up. You will be treated fairly." And for the first time in the war, dazed, terrified, and utterly defeated, Japanese soldiers would stumble out of their caves, their hands raised, their spirit shattered. The flamethrower was a psychological can opener. It didn't just kill the men inside the bunker. It killed the idea of the bunker. It proved that no concrete was thick enough, no tunnel deep enough, to hide from a liquid fire that could flow like water and hunt you in the dark. The Marines believed the flamethrower was the most terrifying weapon because they were the ones who had to use it. The terror was a two-way street. Wielding it inflicted a scar that riflemen, and even machine gunners, would never know. The title is not why the Japanese believed. It is why the Marines believed. They believed it because it was a weapon that felt un-American. It felt like a tool of a darker, more medieval age. The M1 Garand was a rifle. The flamethrower was a monster. Marines in after-action reports and post-war diaries wrote of the experience with a sense of haunted detachment. They described the sickly sweet smell of carbonized flesh. They described the nightmares. When a rifleman killed an enemy, it was a kill. When a flamethrower operator cleared a bunker, he had scorched it, torched it, or cooked it. The language itself was a psychological defense mechanism, a way to distance the man from the act. Corporal Smokey Harris, after fixing the pillbox, would have to live with the memory of the men he had forced to surrender and the ones he had not. He was the hero of his platoon, the man who had saved them, but he was also the man who had wielded the torch. This moral and psychological weight, the act of using a weapon so effective, so brutal and so utterly final, was what made it. In the minds of the Marines who had to pull the trigger, the most terrifying weapon of all, the Battle of Iwo Jima was, in the words of General Holland Howlin' Mad Smith, a nightmare in hell. It was won not by ships and not by planes, but by 70 Orpses, Marines with rifles, demolition charges, and flamethrowers. The flamethrower was statistically decisive. The island was divided into 500-yard sectors. A sector was not cleared until the blowtorch and corkscrew teams had gone bunker to bunker, hole to hole, and scorched every position, either killing the occupants or, more often, sealing them in. As the battle progressed, tanks were modified, with the M4 Sherman Zippo replacing its main gun with a massive flamethrower that could shoot a river of fire 100 yards. Of the 22,000 Japanese defenders on Iwo Jima, only 216 were captured in the first month. The rest, over 21,000 men, were killed. A vast unknown percentage of that number were not killed by bullets, but were entombed by the flamethrower, either by its fire or by the bulldozers that followed, sealing the torched caves. The flamethrower, an ancient and brutal weapon, was the perfect, terrible answer to the Japanese doctrine of subterranean no-surrender warfare. The Marines believed it was the most terrifying weapon because they saw firsthand that it was the only tool that could defeat an enemy who was not afraid to die, but was, in the end, terrified of being burned alive. It was the weapon that broke the Bushido Code. and one bunker at a time won the war in the Pacific.